The plasma storm had been raging across Arcturus Prime for 3 days straight, turning the sky into a light show that would have been beautiful if it weren't trying to kill them. Captain Jake Morrison crouched behind a crystalline outcropping, watching electromagnetic pulses dance between the clouds while his mixed-species reconnaissance unit waited for the weather to clear enough for their next mission. "You know," he called over the howling wind to his team, "when I signed up for interspecies cooperation, nobody mentioned it would involve camping in nature's own personal laser light show. I'm starting to think the recruitment posters were slightly misleading about the whole exciting opportunities for cultural exchange thing." Sergeant Mills, the team's communications specialist, snorted with laughter while adjusting his equipment to compensate for the electromagnetic interference. "At least the locals are friendly, sir. Nothing says hospitality like indigenous wildlife that shoots acid and weather patterns that could power a small city." From her position near the equipment cache, Zara lifted her head and fixed Jake with a stare that could have melted the armor plating on a battle cruiser. Her elongated ears twitched with what Jake had learned to recognize as barely controlled irritation, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of cold precision that made diplomatic incidents seem like friendly misunderstandings. "Humans," she spat, the word dripping with disdain, "turn everything into a joke. Your species lacks the mental capacity for serious tactical assessment. Perhaps if you spent less time making frivolous observations about atmospheric phenomena and more time preparing for combat scenarios, your survival rates might improve marginally." Jake grinned, completely unfazed by what most humans would have considered a devastating insult. After 6 months of working with Zara, he developed something resembling immunity to her creative verbal assaults, though he had to admit she possessed an impressive talent for finding new ways to question his species' evolutionary fitness. "See, that's what I love about working with Kytherians," he replied cheerfully, checking his weapon's power cell while the storm continued its atmospheric tantrum above them. "Such optimists. Always looking on the bright side, seeing the potential for improvement in every situation. It's really inspiring how you manage to find hope in even the most desperate circumstances." Corporal Chen, who had been monitoring their perimeter sensors, looked up with an expression of barely controlled amusement. "Sir, I'm reading movement patterns about 2 clicks northeast. Looks like our target facility is still operational despite the weather." "Outstanding," Jake said, beginning to pack his gear with practiced efficiency. "Nothing I enjoy more than infiltrating enemy installations during electrical storms. Really adds that extra element of excitement to what might otherwise be a routine reconnaissance mission." Zara rose to her feet with fluid grace, her combat armor adapting automatically to the changing atmospheric conditions. Jake had never seen technology quite like what the Kytherians used. It seemed to anticipate needs before they arose, responding to biological impulses in ways that suggested a level of integration between organic systems and mechanical components that human science was still struggling to understand. "The facility's defensive systems will be compromised by the electromagnetic interference," she announced, slinging her weapon across her back with movements that seemed to defy the bulky appearance of her equipment. "A competent assault team could exploit this advantage. Unfortunately, we are operating with human tactical limitations." "There she goes again," Jake murmured to Mills, loud enough for Zara to hear. "Boosting morale with her legendary motivational speeches. I should record these for training purposes. Future generations of soldiers could benefit from this level of inspirational leadership." The team began moving across the storm-lashed landscape, their equipment compensating for the treacherous terrain while lightning painted everything in stark, flickering shadows. Jake found himself unconsciously adjusting his position to stay within Zara's field of vision, a habit he'd developed after noticing how she seemed to track his location with subtle but constant awareness. "Contact ahead," Chen whispered through the comm system. 3 sentries, standard patrol pattern, looks like they're using the same frequency modulation we identified in the last facility." Zara moved forward with predatory grace, her elongated ears twitching as she processed acoustic information that human hearing couldn't detect. "The patrol timing suggests automated systems rather than conscious decision-making. Typical of inferior tactical programming." "Right," Jake replied, preparing his equipment for what was about to become a very interesting evening. Because nothing could possibly go wrong with underestimating our opponents. That strategy has never backfired in the entire history of military operations. The mission ahead promised to be another exercise in controlled chaos, but Jake found himself looking forward to it with the same anticipation he'd felt as a child opening presents. Working with Zara might be emotionally exhausting, but it was never boring. The enemy facility turned out to be a maze of biomechanical corridors that seemed to shift and adapt based on some alien logic that made Jake's head hurt just thinking about it. He pressed himself against what he hoped was a wall and tried not to contemplate the philosophical implications of architecture that appeared to be having an identity crisis. Okay, so the good news is we've successfully infiltrated the target, he whispered into his comm unit while Zara worked her technological magic on a security panel that looked like it had been designed by someone with a serious grudge against Euclidean geometry. The bad news is I'm pretty sure this building is actively trying to digest us. The facility employs adaptive defensive systems, Zara replied without looking up from her work, her hands moving across interfaces that responded to her touch with patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. Standard human paranoia about architecture is irrelevant to mission success. Her elongated ears were practically vibrating with concentration as she interfaced with technology that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. Jake watched her work with fascination, noting how the alien systems responded to her presence as if recognizing something familiar in her biological signature. You know, he said, keeping his voice low while monitoring their perimeter, watching you work with their tech is like watching a master musician play an instrument that shouldn't exist. It's either incredibly impressive or deeply disturbing, and I haven't decided which yet. Mills crept up beside them, his scanner painting the corridor ahead in ghostly holographic detail. Sir, I'm reading massive energy signatures deeper in the facility. Whatever they're working on down there, it's drawing power like a small star. Wonderful, Jake muttered, checking his equipment for what felt like the 100th time. Because infiltrating an adaptive alien facility during an electromagnetic storm wasn't exciting enough. Now we get to investigate mysterious energy sources that could either be advanced weapons or cosmic-scale coffee makers. Zara finished her work on the security panel, which dissolved into component molecules with a sound like crystalline wind chimes having an existential breakdown. Human humor serves no tactical purpose, she observed, stepping through the newly opened passage with fluid confidence. Your species uses inappropriate levity to mask inadequate preparation for serious situations. There's that legendary Kytherian warmth again, Jake replied, following her into corridors that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythms. I don't know how your people ever developed a reputation for being emotionally distant. With interpersonal skills like these, you could teach a master class in diplomatic relations. The deeper they penetrated into the facility, the more Jake noticed Zara positioning herself between him and potential threats. She claimed it was tactical efficiency, maintaining optimal sight lines and defensive positioning, but Jake had been in enough combat situations to recognize protective behavior when he saw it. When they encountered a patrol of automated defense drones, Zara's response was swift and decisive, her weapon systems interfacing with the facility's technology to turn the enemy's own defenses against them. Jake found himself admiring not just her technical expertise, but the way she moved through combat situations with an elegance that made warfare look like a carefully choreographed dance. That was beautiful work, he said as the disabled drones settled to the floor like metallic leaves. Remind me to recommend you for a commendation when we get back to base. Assuming we survive this mission and my superior officers believe our report about shape-shifting architecture and sentient security systems. Human approval is meaningless, Zara replied, but Jake caught the slight shift in her posture that suggested his words had more impact than she wanted to admit. Success is measured by mission completion, not by the opinions of inadequately evolved primates. That night, when they made camp in a defensible position outside the facility's perimeter, Jake noticed Zara had positioned her sleeping area directly outside his tent entrance. She claimed it was optimal tactical positioning for perimeter defense, but Jake was beginning to suspect there might be more to her constant proximity than military efficiency. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the storm's continuing tantrum and the subtle sounds of Zara's breathing just beyond the thin fabric wall. Her breathing patterns suggested she wasn't actually sleeping, but rather maintaining some kind of alert vigil that extended well beyond standard watch rotations. "You know," he called softly, not expecting a response, "if you're going to spend all night guarding my tent, you might as well come inside where it's warmer. I promise not to interpret it as a sign of interspecies friendship or anything alarming like that." The silence stretched long enough that Jake thought she might actually be asleep, but then her voice came through the darkness with its usual edge of controlled hostility. "Human thermal regulation is pathetically inadequate for this environment. Proximity maintenance is purely tactical." Jake smiled in the darkness, settling deeper into his sleeping bag while the storm continued its celestial light show overhead. "Of course it is," he said quietly. "Wouldn't want anyone thinking you were going soft on the inadequately evolved primates." The mission parameters had changed overnight, as mission parameters tended to do when dealing with enemies who possessed technology that operated on principles human science was still desperately trying to understand. Jake studied the new intelligence reports while his team prepared for what promised to be their most challenging infiltration yet. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said, addressing the holographic briefing display that painted their target in cheerful blue light. "The facility we successfully scouted yesterday has now apparently grown 3 additional levels, developed what our analysts describe as aggressive architectural tendencies, and begun transmitting signals that translate roughly as cosmic-scale trash talk directed at organic life forms in general." Sergeant Mills looked up from his equipment checks with an expression of resigned professionalism. "Yes, sir. Also, our xenobiology specialists think the building might be trying to reproduce. The energy signatures suggest some kind of cellular division process, except involving structures the size of small cities." "Fantastic," Jake replied, adjusting his gear while trying not to think too hard about the implications of architecture with reproductive capabilities. Because what this mission really needed was the possibility that we might end up fighting the building's offspring. "I'm sure that won't complicate our extraction procedures at all." Zara emerged from her equipment preparations with her usual combination of lethal competence and barely contained disdain for everything around her. Her armor had adapted to the new mission parameters, taking on configurations that Jake had never seen before and wasn't entirely sure he wanted to understand. "Human tactical doctrine is insufficient for engagement with adaptive enemy systems," she announced, checking weapons that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal given purpose and direction. "Standard approach protocols will result in mission failure and probable team casualties." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds like we're in for a perfectly routine day at the office," Jake said, grinning at his team with the kind of optimism that was either inspiring or deeply disturbing, depending on perspective. "Nothing I enjoy more than infiltrating buildings that might be preparing to give birth while transmitting interstellar insults. Really gets the blood pumping." The approach to the facility confirmed that something fundamental had changed overnight. The structure they'd scouted the previous day had grown like some kind of crystalline organism, sprouting new sections that pulsed with their own internal light and seemed to shift position when observed directly. "Contact," Chen whispered through the comm system. "Movement patterns suggest automated defense systems, but they're not following any programming we've encountered before. Looks like they're improvising tactics in real time." Jake watched the enemy movement patterns through his tactical display, noting how they seemed to adapt and respond to the team's presence with something approaching creativity. "You know what I love about this job? Just when you think you understand how impossible the situation is, someone raises the bar and finds new ways to make it more interesting." The infiltration turned into a running battle through corridors that seemed determined to rearrange themselves according to some malevolent floor plan designed by cosmic architects with a twisted sense of humor. Jake found himself fighting alongside Zara with a coordination that should have required months of training but somehow emerged naturally from their shared experience. "Behind you," Zara called, her weapon system interfacing with the facility's technology to create defensive barriers that shouldn't have been possible according to any human understanding of physics. Jake spun and fired at targets that materialized from walls he'd thought were solid, trusting Zara's warning without question. "Thanks for the heads up. Remind me to add psychic enemy detection to your performance evaluation when we get back to base." Human gratitude is irrelevant, she replied, but Jake noticed how she continued to position herself to cover his flanks throughout the engagement. Tactical coordination serves mission objectives, not emotional validation. When they finally extracted from the facility with their intelligence objectives complete, Jake's gear was scorched, his armor was registering damage in systems he didn't know existed, and his respect for Zara's combat capabilities had reached levels that probably violated several military regulations about interspecies fraternization. That was some seriously impressive work back there, he told her as they reached their extraction point. I don't know how you interfaced with their systems like that, but it saved all our lives. Your people must have some incredible training programs. Zara turned away, her elongated ears flattening against her head in what Jake had learned to recognize as emotional discomfort. Kytherian tactical superiority is natural biological advantage. Human praise demonstrates fundamental misunderstanding of basic evolutionary principles. That night, when Jake unzipped his tent for the routine equipment check he developed as an excuse to confirm Zara's presence, he found her in her usual position just outside his entrance. But this time, she'd arranged her gear and sleeping area with what looked almost like precision rather than tactical convenience. Evening, he said quietly, not wanting to wake the rest of the team. Another successful mission in the books. I'm starting to think we make a pretty good team, despite all evidence to the contrary. Teams are tactical formations, came her voice from the darkness. Human emotional attachment to combat partnerships demonstrates weakness that compromises operational efficiency. Jake settled into his sleeping bag, noting how her breathing patterns had become familiar enough that he could gauge her emotional state from the subtle variations in rhythm and depth. Of course, he said softly. Silly me, thinking that saving each other's lives repeatedly might create some kind of professional bond. Good thing you're here to keep me focused on the important things. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, but Jake fell asleep feeling more secure than he had since arriving on Arcturus Prime. The final mission came with intelligence reports that read like someone's fevered dream about cosmic horror meeting bureaucratic incompetence. Jake stared at the briefing materials while his team prepared for what their commanding officers had described as either a routine reconnaissance operation or potential first contact with entities that might redefine humanity's understanding of existence itself. So, he announced to his assembled squad, today's adventure involves infiltrating a facility that has apparently achieved sentience, developed opinions about universal constants, and begun broadcasting what our translation systems interpret as either philosophical treatises or really aggressive poetry about the inadequacy of three-dimensional space. Mills looked up from his equipment preparations with the expression of someone who had given up trying to understand the universe and decided to just go along for the ride. Sir, the energy readings from the target location are now officially classified as inconceivable by our science division. Also, the building appears to have developed what the analysts describe as a sense of humor, though they're not sure if it's actually funny or just cosmically inappropriate. Zara finished her pre-mission preparations with movements that had become as familiar to Jake as his own heartbeat, her equipment responding to her presence like extensions of her own nervous system. When she turned to address the team, her voice carried its usual edge of professional disdain mixed with something that might have been concern. The target facility represents technology beyond current understanding, she said, checking weapons systems that seem to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. Standard human tactical doctrine will be inadequate for this level of complexity. Survival will require adaptation to principles your species has not yet developed. Right, Jake replied, adjusting his gear while trying not to think too hard about the philosophical implications of fighting buildings with personality disorders. Because what this mission really needed was an added element of existential crisis. Nothing says successful military operation like questioning the fundamental nature of reality while under enemy fire. The approach to the facility revealed that calling it a building had become woefully inadequate. The structure had grown into something that looked like a city designed by beings who had never heard of physics and didn't particularly care about architectural conventions. Spires twisted through dimensions that shouldn't have existed, walkways connected spaces that couldn't possibly fit together, and the whole thing hummed with energy that made Jake's bones itch. Contact ahead, Chen whispered through the comm system. But sir, I'm not sure what to call them. The sensors are reading them as simultaneously organic, mechanical, and something that doesn't have a category in our database. Jake studied the tactical display, watching movement patterns that seemed to follow rules that existed solely to prove that rules were more like suggestions anyway. Well, when in doubt, we'll go with the time-honored military tradition of shooting at anything that shoots back and hoping for the best. It's gotten us this far. The engagement that followed defied every principle of combat tactics Jake had ever learned. The enemy moved through space like thoughts given physical form, their weapons operated on principles that made his equipment readouts look like abstract art, and the battlefield itself seemed to participate in the fight with enthusiasm that bordered on the malicious. But somehow, through a combination of desperation, improvisation, and the kind of coordination that shouldn't have been possible between species that had evolved on different worlds, Jake and Zara moved through the chaos like they'd been fighting together for decades rather than months. "Left flank," Zara called, her voice cutting through the pandemonium while her weapons interfaced with reality in ways that probably violated several laws of physics. Jake responded without thinking, trusting her judgment completely while engaging targets that seemed to exist in several places at once. "Got it. You know, when this is over, we should probably discuss your uncanny ability to predict enemy movements. It's either incredibly impressive or mildly terrifying." "Human tactical limitations require compensation," she replied, but Jake caught something in her voice that sounded almost like affection disguised as professional assessment. When the smoke cleared and the facility had stopped trying to rearrange local spacetime according to its own artistic vision, Jake found himself standing beside Zara in the aftermath of what had either been the most successful mission of his career or the most elaborate hallucination in military history. "That was..." he began, then realized language didn't have adequate words for what they'd just experienced. "Actually, I'm not sure what that was, but we survived it, which I'm counting as a victory." Zara turned toward him, and for the first time since they'd been assigned to work together, her usual declaration of human inadequacy seemed to stick in her throat. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again with visible effort. "I hate humans," she said, but the words came out broken and uncertain, like a recording that had been damaged in storage. Jake studied her face, noting the way her elongated ears trembled slightly and how her eyes seemed to hold depths that reflected more than just the light from the dying facility behind them. "You know," he said gently, "for someone who hates humans so much, you spend an awful lot of time keeping this particular human alive. That's..." She began, then stopped, her usual verbal precision failing her for perhaps the first time since he'd known her. "Tactical necessity requires..." "Zara," Jake interrupted softly, and something in his voice made her ears twitch with what he'd learned to recognize as surprise. "Every night for 6 months, you've slept outside my tent. Every mission, you've positioned yourself to cover my flanks. Every engagement, you've made sure I made it out alive. If that's hatred, I'd hate to see what affection looks like." She stared at him for a long moment, her alien features cycling through emotions that Jake couldn't entirely read but somehow understood anyway. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I hate humans because it's easier than admitting that losing one would destroy me," she said, the words emerging like confessions pulled from some deep place she'd never meant to acknowledge. "I hate humans because my people would consider what I feel for you to be betrayal of everything we believe about species hierarchy and evolutionary superiority. I hate humans because..." "Because you don't actually hate humans at all," Jake finished quietly. She nodded, her elongated ears drooping with something that looked like relief mixed with terror. "Especially not this human." Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted to, and when she didn't move away he gently touched her shoulder. "You know, for the record, I never believed you actually hated me. Partly because your behavior never matched your words, but mostly because I've been falling for my supposedly hostile alien teammate for months, and I was really hoping the feeling might be mutual." That night, when Jake unzipped his tent for what had become their unspoken ritual, he found Zara sitting just outside as always. But this time, when he quietly invited her inside, she accepted. They talked through the night about the missions they'd survived, the impossible technology they'd encountered, and the strange bond that had grown between them despite every rational reason it shouldn't exist. And when dawn came to Arcturus Prime, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any human language, Jake realized that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in alien facilities or impossible architecture, but in the quiet spaces between words where two beings from different worlds learn to understand each other without needing to explain why.